Francis D. Sales College, popularly known as SFS College, Electronics City, Bangalore, belongs to the network of educational institutions run by the Franzalian Fathers of the Southwest India province, functioning under the MSFS congregation. Throughout the world, the Franzalians are known for their achievements in bringing quality educational opportunities to rural areas. St. Francis de Sales College came into existence in 2004 with the motto Excellence, Transformation and Efficiency. It is a minority recognized institution that is permanently affiliated with Bangalore University. The college was granted an A grade by the NEP in 2015. The postgraduate center was added to the college in 2017. In the year 2018, the college obtained 2F and 12B recognition under the UGC Act of 1965. With the AICTE approval, financial courses such as MBA in HR, Finance and Marketing, and BBA Aviation Management was started in 2020. College is also an ISO certified institution. At present, we offer at SFS College the following undergraduate and postgraduate courses: BA, JPE, Journalism, Psychology, Optional English; BA SEP, Sociology, Economics, Psychology; BA HEP, History, Economics, Political Science; BA HES, History, Economics and Sociology; BSc MEC, Mathematics, Electronics, Computer Science; BSc PCM, Physics, Chemistry, Mathematics; BSc CJP, Computer Science, Journalism, Psychology; BCom, Finance and Accounts, BCom, Travel and Tourism; BCA, Bachelor of Computer Application; BBA, Bachelor of Business Administration, BBA in Aviation Management. Our postgraduate courses are MBA. Specialization subjects are Human Resource Management, Finance, and Marketing. MA English Literature, MA Economics, MSc Psychology, MSc Mathematics, MCom, MCom, MFA. Postgraduate diploma courses are PG Diploma in Human Resource Management, PG Diploma in Psychological Counseling. Some of our popular add-on courses are CA, CS, CMA, Aviation Management, Artificial Intelligence, Digital Marketing, Data Science, Mass Media and Communication, UPSC, and NET Coaching.
This light cafeteria with food and snacks to keep the energy levels high all through the day also acts as a lovely place to chill out with friends. A number of large halls like the seminar halls and the conference rooms for organizing seminars and workshops, and an open auditorium that can contain over 3,000 people. Sports is an area that is given great encouragement at our college, with facilities like the basketball, the volleyball, the football, baseball, and the softball courts, along with a shooting range. And this is complemented with a state-of-the-art gymnasium to keep you fit and fine. You feel like getting closer to nature as well as relaxing your mind? Then we have a beautiful birds park to comfort you with peace and serenity. Knowledge is power is a quote that we strongly believe in. And this is boosted with the presence of a library covering various disciplines and subjects with many national and international journals as well as magazines. Technology is also well tapped in our college with an e-library that gives access to thousands of ebooks and journals, as well as having projectors and visual aids in classrooms to facilitate learning. Nation building is a strong value we believe in, and this is promoted with a well-disciplined unit of the NCC, the NSS, and the Civil Defense Cadets. Yes, we at SFS also ease your financial transactions by having a nationalized bank within our campus. With an early to start and better to perform slogan, we have our college timings from 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. thus also helping many of our students to take up part-time jobs and thus promoting the concept of earn and learn. With many reputed companies visiting our college, we also ensure placements for our students right after the completion of their course.
As we constantly strive to achieve excellence and progress, we expect the college to be an autonomous college in the near future. With immense pleasure, we welcome you to the portals of St. Francis de Sales College and Postgraduate Center, a temple of learning. Welcome all.
Well, a very good afternoon to everyone, and that was St. Francis de Sales College, Bangalore. Before we move on to our session for today, we would like to revisit our instructions for the afternoon. Kindly mute your microphones and do switch off your videos for better quality. You can raise your queries in the chat box, and the moderator will take your questions to the speaker. Progress is measured by richness and intensity of experience, and experience really matters in every individual's life. A very good afternoon and a warm welcome to day 5 of the FDP, Integrated Learning and the NEP 2020. Organized by the IQAC, St. Francis de Sales College, Bangalore. We have had a great exposure to wonderful sessions that have strengthened our minds on NEP 2020. Today, being the 5th day of our FDP, we would like to welcome everyone to session 7. A special note of welcome and appreciation to Dr. Arulmani from St. Joseph's College, Bangalore, for having accepted our invitation and for taking up in charge of taking care of the session this afternoon. On behalf of St. Francis de Sales College, we'd once again like to render a cordial welcome to everyone. Before we move on to the session, we'd like to invoke the blessings of God through our short prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. We are indeed very glad to have with us this afternoon Dr. Arulmani, one of the senior lecturers from St. Joseph's College, to handle the session this afternoon. I request Professor Ramandeep to introduce our speaker for the day.
Good afternoon, everyone. Dr. Arul Mani is currently working as a professor in Department of English, St. Joseph College, India. His research interests include curriculum design, examination reforms, world literature, stylistic, the graphic novel, long-form journalism, Latin American literature. He is serving as an editorial member and reviewer of several international reputed journals. He has more than 26 years of experience in the academic field. Dr. Arul Mani is a member of many international affiliations. He has authored many research articles, books related to curriculum design, and it's working on the UGC project titled Magazine Redux, the online rebirth of reading. He has curated Meta Josephite Festival of Literature, a unique campus literary festival since its 2013 inception. He also curated Asquin's KQA Founding University Quiz Festival and Sesame Open Quiz Forum from 2013 to 2012, and publications allied to Asquin's, and the, these are the KQA Yearbook and the KQ School Quiz Book during that period. He designed and curated KQA properties such as Mahaquizzer, the National Solo Quizzing Championship 2005 to 2007, Megawatt, the National Teen Quizzing Championship 2009 to 2012, Mindsweep KQA International Solo Quizzing Contest 2012, and Asia Sweep 2012. He has also curated Open Dosa, an online magazine devoted to student writing, and Youngster, a print magazine chronicling the work of the Department of English, St. Joseph College since 2016. I welcome you, sir. I request you to take over the session. Over to sir.
Good afternoon. Uh, Thank you for that introduction. I hope I'm audible.
Yes,
I'll
you
just
are
try to
audible.
share my screen.
So your screen is visible? I suppose Sir is facing some network issues. We're getting to him, and he should be joining us in a few minutes. We are checking with Sir, and he will be back onto the session in a few minutes. Kindly hold on.
Good afternoon. Are you able to hear me now?
Yes, sir, we are able to hear you.
Yeah, I think my browser is causing some problems on account of the video. It's crashing.
Okay.
Let me just see if I can try talking without switching the camera on.
All
That
right,
seems to
sir.
be the simplest way to operate this. Sorry about that.
Fine, sir.
Yeah.
If that's
Oh,
convenient for you, it's
sure,
fine.
sure. Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure being at SFS College to talk on this topic, imagining an educational policy for an affiliated institution. When I was asked to speak at this IQAC venture, right, I first asked myself, what is it that we can do together that will be useful and interesting for an affiliated institution that is looking at these many departures and changes in policy that are being ushered in along with the NEP, right? Since Karnataka is aiming to be the first state or among the first adapters to the NEP, right? It also means that that debates over the NEP and over its adaptation become extremely crucial to institutions in higher education, right, such as ours, right? Affiliated colleges, autonomous colleges, universities, you name it. We are all, in some sense, caught up in this debate. It's a conversation, really, that is now upon us. It's something we have to deal with, right? Now, I'm using the word imagining for a very specific reason, right? For me, that is the most important response when we look at the NEP and when we look at the version of the NEP that is going to be inaugurated in Karnataka fairly soon, right? When we say imagining, the most important part of that word, right, is that it's an operation that we perform, right? Why is this necessary? Why is it necessary for this act of imagining to happen? I hold that it's important, and I'll tell you why. I don't know how many of you have read the NEP, right? It's a very elaborate document and one that requires very careful reading to understand, right? But
Pardon me, sir.
yes,
Pardon me, sir. Sir,
can you?
are you trying to share your screen?
I'm not. I'm not.
You are not sharing the screen.
Yeah,
All right, sir.
yeah, yeah. Okay. Right. If we ask one simple question, right, after reading the NEP, right, that simple question will be, how are my experiences reflected in this document? If you ask that question as a teacher from an affiliated college, right, the first thing that you will find is that your experiences possibly have only a tangential connection. Your experiences as a teacher teaching in an affiliated college in Karnataka, in Bangalore city, in one of the three universities in Bangalore, right? These experiences find only tangential reflection, only a kind of vague, sort of shadowy occurrence in the NEP, right? The committee that has produced the NEP has tried in many ways to fit together a policy that addresses the needs of the nation, right? And one of the unfortunate results of this process is the fact that it ends up addressing a whole range of concerns, right? And only now and then do we find our concerns reflected there, right? So if you look at the very first thing that the reader sitting in Bangalore finds when they read the account of higher education that the NEP produces, they will see that the thrust towards multidisciplinarity that the NEP is talking about is in many ways already there in the form of university education that a state like Karnataka has. In the concept of the three major degree course, whether it's a BA or a BSc, right, and in many ways reflected also in the composition of courses in BCom degrees, right? What you have is actually great multidisciplinarity, right? You have three majors coming together to sort of inform the student in terms of what the Faculty of Sciences is trying to do, or what the humanities or the social sciences are trying to do, what different faculties like these are trying to do, right? So for us sitting in Bangalore, this conversation about multidisciplinarity, right, is one that we have already had, right, is one that we are already in some senses exploring in our campuses, and is one that we are already invested in, right? But one of the problems with the NEP is that it does not look at the diversity of the educational scenario in higher education across the country, right? It assumes that single major degrees and single major or double major degrees are the norm for everybody. So it does not look at the fact that there are these diversities and there is a history behind this diversity. That is one of the problems, one of the quarrels that one can pick with the NEP. The more crucial issue that is turning up in Karnataka, because what has been proposed in the curriculum that has been shared across the board, across the state, right, is a system that seems to look at the single or the double major as a genuine replacement for whatever the triple major degree used to offer. Now, the problem with that decision, right, is that there hasn't been enough of a conversation about it, right? If the triple major system is one that has failures, right, what are its failures? How do we remedy those failures, right? Are the single major 4-degree courses or the double major 4-degree courses necessarily the best solution to the problems that triple major courses may have? The second issue is, what about the successes of the triple major system? Do we need to forget them? Do we need to junk them altogether? So this conversation is now beginning to happen, right? And it's one that unfortunately is not getting the time and the energy that it requires, right? Because there is the speed with which we are progressing towards the 4-year curriculum, right? Now, if you look at European universities, what they do very sensibly is they say that bachelor's degree can be between 3 to 4 years, depending upon local needs, depending upon specific needs that specific societies, specific academic contexts may have, right? So I think there is something that we can learn from that, something we can take from that, in the sense that we can possibly also look at having an ecosystem where triple major degrees coexist with single major or double major programs. The other problem I'd like to highlight is that there is a history of experimentation with honors degrees and with single major programs in Karnataka. This has happened several times. It has happened in the 60s, it has happened in the 70s, it happened once again in the early 2000s, right? And in each of these occasions, the attempt did not survive. The experiment did not progress into a functioning, sustainable sort of process. Right now, there may be many reasons why that happened, but the one important question here, right, is a sense of history. If it failed, why did it fail? Right? If it did not work, why did it not work? Right? So this is the other problem that people who are historically minded, people who are interested in looking at the issue of quality in higher education carefully, in terms of if something has worked, do you need to get rid of it altogether? If something has worked, is it better to adapt it or to have the possibility of multiple kinds of degrees in place? Right? So someone who's thinking about it carefully, this haste seems a little unnecessary. It seems a little dangerous also. Right? That's the other point that I would like to make. So in relation to this question of imagining an educational policy that works for affiliated institutions. So affiliated institutions are in some sense at the receiving end of a process like this. A decision is taken, you have to go with that decision, right? But it's important that a conversation happens. It's important that an institution like SFS, like the many other affiliated colleges within Bangalore University, are able to talk about what is going to work for them, what has worked for them, right? These experiences are important. These experiences have to be taken into account if one is looking at engaging well with the NEP, with the National Education Policy. Because what is recommended in places where a system hasn't worked, right, has to be looked at critically from the point of view of where it has worked also, right? So that's one sense in which we are talking about the idea of imagining an educational policy. So the moment you read the NEP, if you've taught in Bangalore University, one question that arises is, are my experiences reflected accurately here? Perhaps not, right? I feel like I have to say something to the policy, right? I feel like I have questions that I want to ask the policy, right? At the same time, right, the NEP also has what I call a kind of necessary ambition, right? It's an important thing for a policy to come with a kind of ambition at its heart, right? What is this ambition that the NEP seems to have? I'll quote one bit here. I'm sorry, my browser is misbehaving, which is why we are forced to do away with the video and function entirely on the audio. I'll just read out a small quote from the NEP. This is from the preamble section of its higher education section. This is what it says. Given 21st century requirements, quality higher education must aim to develop good, thoughtful, well-rounded, and creative individuals. It must enable an individual to study one or more specialized areas of interest at a deep level and also develop character, ethical, and constitutional values, intellectual curiosity, scientific temper, creativity, spirit of service, and 21st century capabilities. right? So this ambition, I find a very valuable thing in the NEP, right? That it's able to perform an act of courage. It says some parts of the existing policies, of the policies that have already been commissioned into action in the past, right, are worth retaining, right? Character, ethical and constitutional values, intellectual curiosity, scientific temper, spirit of service, all of these go back to early Nehruvian times when the idea of a policy began to take root. Right? What is the nature of education in India? What is the purpose of higher education in India? Right? So when it aligns with those values from the historical past, right, it also it offers a kind of continuity, and it offers the ambition of also looking at the future and estimating what that future might need. And this is what it says. A quality higher education must enable personal accomplishment and enlightenment, constructive public engagement, and productive contribution to the society. It must prepare students for more meaningful and satisfying lives and work roles. This is the most important thing about the national education policy, the most important, the most interesting thing that it says, right? What it's really saying is that it does not see education as merely a process that feeds into the economy, that feeds into the job market, right? That the job of colleges is producing qualified labor. It is not saying that, right? It is saying that is a small ambition. We need to have a bigger ambition than that, a bigger ambition than producing qualified labor. We need to produce citizens. We need to produce people capable of thinking for themselves, capable of critical thought, capable of responding to the situation around them. This is the necessary ambition that I find commendable about the national education policy. So my response to it is a mixed response. There are parts of it that I'm very critical about, right? And parts of it that I find myself responding to, find myself attracted to, find myself interested in, right? And because there are these two aspects, right? Those of critical questioning and those of support, those of interest and engagement, I hold that it's important to resolve the contradictions that the policy seems to contain through an act of imagination. It is only through this act of imagination that we can find something in the policy that works for us, right? The policy does not address all of our experiences and our needs and questions. In such a situation, we should reflect from our experiences, ask critical questions, and draw from what the policy is able to offer us, right? This is the broad engagement and response I have to offer after reading it several times, right? Now, for an affiliated institution like SFS, right? One of the things that the policy offers, right, is a kind of future vision, right? What is this future vision that the policy seems to offer, right? It says very clearly that the solution to the various problems that bedevil higher education today, right? It offers 5 solutions. One solution is moving towards an educational system consisting of large multidisciplinary universities and colleges, right? The second solution it offers is more multidisciplinary undergraduate education. The third and interesting possibility that it holds out is moving towards autonomy for faculty and for institutions. It then talks about revamping curricula, right? And also providing for faculty security. These are the 5 key solutions that it offers to a long list of problems that it identifies. Now, if you look at the problems that the NEP is identifying, there too the spirit of contradiction turns up, right? Because at one level, the NEP is saying, let us not centralize, right? Let us give more autonomy. And at the same time, it is also recommending things that will lead to further centralization, right? That is one of the contradictions that I find interesting in the NEP. Every policy is put together by a committee, and committees themselves come with contradictions and problems, right? And I think it shows up in an interesting way in this particular contradiction, where the NEP seems unable to offer a clear path in terms of whether to offer autonomy or to centralize, right? One of the key problems in higher education has been over-centralization, right? Affiliated colleges very often find themselves in this bind, right? Where your ability to deliver is ultimately limited by the fact that examinations and curricula are decided somewhere else. The mode of examination is decided somewhere else. What happens in the examinations is outside the college, right? What is possible in terms of curriculum and curriculum implementation, right, is always as an afterthought, right? The decisions about curricula happen elsewhere. If you're lucky, you may be a participant in it. If not, you just have to take what is given to you, right? So this issue, right, it tries to address when it says, let's look at autonomy, let's look at giving faculty more autonomy, institutions more autonomy. But at the same time, it keeps talking about the need for greater regulation, the need for setting up a system that is uniform across the country, and so on, right? So these are some of the unresolved contradictions that I find there. But as I said, when we look at its ambitions, right, when it tries to offer solutions, some of those solutions are worth looking at seriously, right? So when it says moving towards a system consisting of large multidisciplinary universities and colleges, right? What it means is that the ecosystem is going to change in such a way that affiliated institutions which show drive, which show ambition, right, which are able to engage constructively with the policy while also doing justice to their audience, to their constituency, right? Such institutions will be able to survive and find a kind of niche, right? A suitable niche for themselves in the new ecosystem that is going to emerge, right? So the destiny they are offering institutions is that of further micro-affiliation, right? If you are not able to sustain this multidisciplinarity, this engagement across different disciplines, then that means you disappear into a cluster, right? Or you stand out because of your capacity for independence, and this allows you to move up, make a quantum leap, right? Become autonomous, become degree giving, and probably in course of time, right, become the nucleus of a cluster university, right? So these are interesting possibilities. There are interesting routes that affiliated colleges can seek to traverse, right, in what the NEP seems to recommend, right? But when it says things like reaffirming the integrity of faculty and institutional leadership, right, through merit appointments and career progression based on teaching, research, and service. Right? What it ignores is the fact that the situation in academia has changed so much because of privatization, because of the fact that it's a very, very volatile labor market, right? That some of these things will be possible only in government-run institutions, but right, the situation may require other measures in other institutions, right? So this is again one of the contradictions that I was talking about. But I'd like to focus on this key aspect of the solution that they are aiming at, this idea of autonomy, right? So how do we engage with that idea of autonomy? That's an interesting question to think about, right? I was also talking about this centralizing tendency. One of the ways in which this centralizing tendency is shown in the policy is where they recommend the establishment of a national research foundation, right? Now, one problem with the idea of research is that the way it is privileged, the way it is funded, there is already a kind of lopsidedness there, right? So what you have is one idea of research being celebrated, being supported, being held up as the norm. And what you actually have is great diversity, right? The idea of research is one thing in the sciences. Even in the sciences, the idea of research takes a certain trajectory. In the physical or the experimental sciences, it takes a different direction in the life sciences, right? Research is of a certain character. In the humanities, it's slightly different in the social sciences, right? It's different in commerce and management. And so what you have is great heterogeneity, right? And what you need is a response to that heterogeneity, right? Which would mean that you need multiple sort of enterprises that support these different ways of doing research, these heterogeneous ways of doing research, right? So with some of these recommendations, it seems either hurried or it seems like the complexity of the issues has not been gone into. I'll just pick up a few other interesting things that the NEP is saying. It is talking at one key recommendation that it makes is that institutions will have the option to run what is known as open distance learning, right? Either through traditional methods such as posts and support material provided through postal services and courier services and online programs, right? Now, this is a great idea because the question of enrollment, the question of education and access to education becoming fair, right, is met at some level through options such as open distance learning and online learning, right? But what we must also remember, right, is that there has been an IGNOU in existence for the longest time, right? What sort of recognition, what sort of valuing happens to people who have gone through open distance learning in the job market? Right? Are they treated with the same respect or the same status as people who've been through live processes of learning? Right? That's a very troubling question, and it's a question that they don't address. Right? If we reflect upon the IGNOU experience, the Indira Gandhi National Open University has done stellar work. Right? They've put together extremely good courses, and they've done their best, right? All the various open university or correspondence type courses that exist in the country, IGNOU is far and away a standard setter, right? But I've had instances where students have come to me and said, the degree that I've taken at IGNOU is often not taken seriously, right? How is that problem going to be solved? right? What recommendations do you have, right? What recommendations can you make to the government, right, in order to make sure that these issues are sorted out, right? That doesn't happen in the policy, right? So while I like this effort that they make at pointing out to the possibilities of open distance learning and online learning, right, especially in terms of improving what is known as graduate enrollment ratio, right? The problem is that the complexity of that issue is not fully addressed, right? Ideas of prestige, ideas of value, ideas of what is better and what is worse are always playing in the field of education, right? Even though IGNOU runs good courses, public perception, right, always sort of pegs students who've taken these courses lower, right? Now, how are you going to address that? Right? That is a key silence in the NEP. Another interesting thing that they say, right? I'll quote this bit for you. They say single stream higher education institutions will be phased out over time, and all will move towards becoming vibrant multidisciplinary institutions, right? Now, this is interesting at two levels. It means that all engineering colleges have to be very worried, right? Or all medical colleges have to be very worried, right? But when you look at the complexity of the systems that they inhabit, right? Engineering colleges are very often part of a technical university, right? Medical colleges are part of a medical sciences or a health sciences university, right? What exactly do they have in mind? Do they want these universities to broad base, to engage with law, to engage with the humanities, to engage with the basic sciences, right? Is that the recommendation that is being made, right? Or is it that that entire system must be dissolved and these colleges must go back to the old affiliating university pattern, right? That is not specified, right? It might have been helpful for them to specify what it is that they wanted and to also provide justifications for that recommendation. The one criticism that I would like to make at this point, while looking at a specific point in the NEP, they talk about returning multidisciplinary learning in India to the standards that were once possible in Takshashila and Nalanda. Right now, Takshashila and Nalanda were all great universities. There is no denying that, right? But there is a fundamental difference between education in that historical period, education as it has historically been understood in India, and the mission of the state, right? The mission of the modern Indian state in relation to education. What is this difference? The education that is visualized by the modern Indian state is a transformative education. And by a transformative education, I don't mean a mere transformation of the individual, right? I mean a transformation of society itself, right? So the choice we are making in supporting a certain ecosystem of primary and higher education, right, is to move away from a society that is unfortunately caught up in inequality, right? To give up such a societal model and to move, to transform from there and to move into a societal model that is based on open access, democracy, and equity, right? So the key problem with referring to a Takshashila and a Nalanda in this context, right, is that Takshashila and Nalanda are not very good models for us in this day and age, right? If you look at the history of universities like Nalanda and Takshashila, right, at some points in their history, they have been open access, where your caste did not matter, right? Where the part of the world that you came from did not matter. But for other significant periods in their history, right, caste restrictions and other such admission restrictions have played a role in these universities. So which part of that history are we referring to? Which part of that history do we want today, right? Should we get into that debate, or should we simply look at the transformatory power of education in our country today? Right? If the republic that the Constitution visualizes is to be achieved, then my guess is that we have to simply put our money behind, right, an education that will transform people, that will free them from the burdens of the past and allow them to deal with the challenges of the present. Right? So that's a specific observation I would like to make about the small disconnect that there is in terms of understanding the historic purpose of higher education in modern India. One interesting thing, so every time I find something that I want to criticize and complain about, I equally find something that is interesting in the policy. So one interesting thing that shows up in the policy is the idea, they make a reference to it, which is unfortunate. They should have written about it more extensively. They refer to the idea of global citizenship education. It's often called GCE, right? The full form is Global Citizenship Education. Now, this is an idea that comes from the UNESCO, right? The UNESCO has made a certain set of recommendations that it has sent to the various member nations, saying that these are some, looking at the problems of the world today, these are some questions that our colleges and universities must address, right? I'll give you an example of what the UNESCO focuses on when it talks of global citizenship education. One of the things it talks about is preventing violent extremism through education. Right? Now, this is definitely a very disruptive force across societies. Right? You have extremism fueled by religion, by ethnicity, by language, by various different concerns. Right? You feel immigrants are coming to your country, you want to prevent that. It produces a certain kind of violence in society, right? So UNESCO has very rightly identified that education can transform, right, by engaging very critically with very deep-seated ideas such as ownership or entitlement or privilege, right? A second example of this GCE, of this global citizenship education, is what the UNESCO calls education about the Holocaust and genocide, right? The Holocaust is one key issue that has occurred in history when the Jews were put into concentration camps and killed off in large numbers by the Nazis. But that has not been an isolated one-off incident. We've had genocide happening repeatedly in recorded history. Right? It's happening, it continues to happen to this day, in this day and age, right? And the UNESCO sees education, specifically higher education, as a very key means by which the very ancient, almost animal passions that produce genocide can be contained and dealt with, right? Two other things that the UNESCO talks about while talking about global citizenship education. One is the role of languages in education. Now, this is one thing that the current curriculum in Karnataka has come in for criticism. Right? It reduces languages to 2 semesters of work. Right? Now, the simple thing that the UNESCO points out too is that just as we have to value biodiversity, in making the world a habitable place for man, right? The world cannot be the world if we design it only for man's comfort, right? We are tied, our fate is tied to the fates of countless other species, to plant life and animal life, and we have to live in careful consciousness of this interrelationship. This is the basic biodiversity argument. Just as there is a biodiversity argument, there is also a cultural diversity argument, right? Each language is a way of experiencing the world. Each culture is essentially produced through the matrix of language. And so every language contains a world within itself, right? And one of the problems, the serious problems that higher education in India is dealing with, right, is that we are becoming an education monoculture, right? That English medium is becoming the norm, and because of the success that comes with adapting to this norm, we are often blind to the fact that the rich world of experience that is concealed in other languages, right, is going untouched, is in some sense disappearing as we speak, because universities and colleges produce people who are tourists in their own mother tongues, right? So this is again a very, very important pinpointing that the UNESCO has done, right? And it's commendable that the NEP has picked this up, right? But at the same time, as I applaud this, I'm also concerned that something like this, which requires more attention and more discussion, right, has been discussed only vaguely, only briefly, right? A little more attention would have been a big contribution to the national conversation. Continuing with some of the other interesting aspects of the NEP, one thing that the NEP itself is able to say is that the degree can be either of 3 years or 4 years with multiple exit options. So this is something we remember because it was proposed a few years ago and it came in for a lot of conversation. What they mean by multiple exit options is that you can finish 1 year of your degree and get a certificate for it, and then go and work if you need to, come back later and continue your degree, right? So you don't drop out anymore. There's a reward for at the end of, if you complete 1 year, you get a certificate. If you complete 2 years, you get a diploma and so on. So for every year that you complete, there is some kind of reward, right? It's a very good idea, right? Because the stigma of being a university dropout is real, right? The idea of rewarding someone for the possible effort they can make is a good idea, right? But the problem that they don't talk about, the elephant that comes into the room at this point, is how are you going to change perceptions of these things, right? The employer who says, I want a graduate, is not going to necessarily turn around and say, okay, I'll take a graduate or somebody with a first-year degree completion certificate, right? If you are going to give certificates like these, you also have to find a way of making them work, right? Find a way of, sitting together with industry, with employers, with government as employer also, and saying, what benefits can people draw from specific moves like these, specific decisions like these, right? That's an important part of the conversation that has not happened, right? And I think it's important that people raise this concern, right? So that justice is done, right? The person who drops out because he doesn't have money, right, to continue with 3 years of education, if he gets a certificate, and if that certificate changes his life, his or her life in some way, right, it's good follow-up to what is a good decision. So that follow-up, I think, is important. I'll just quickly run through some of the other things that I find interesting in the NEP. There are 4 or 5 things I want to pinpoint and talk about. One is the set of goals that it sets up, right? It sets up a very ambitious set of goals, nearly, let me count, 12 such goals, right? In terms of providing access, in terms of reducing the cost of education, in terms of aiming for inclusivity and so on, right? In terms of looking at gender justice, right? All these are very good suggestions, right? But once again, the other part of my brain, which is reading this, starts asking the question, how will you implement this? What specific suggestions can you make in terms of implementing or making these goals accessible? Right? Some of you may have noticed that the NEP mandates a return of teacher education to educational institutions. Right? Earlier, what you had was teacher training happening in standalone institutions. Right? The NEP makes this one point. It says teacher education requires multidisciplinary inputs. And so the suggestion is that the teacher training degree, the B.Ed kind of degree, should come back to the university and the college, right? That it should be part of the array of courses. Right? You can have a BSc, you can also have a BSc that becomes a B.Ed, right? In the same college, right? It's a good suggestion, right? Because what they've recognized is one important question: where are the teachers of tomorrow going to come from? What about the training that they might require? The second thing that they talk about is that we have to set up multiple mechanisms to combat the commercialization of higher education. It's a very grand thing for the NEP to be saying, right? But what it first has to address is the government's decision to pull out of higher education. If commercialization is happening, right? If the law of the market is enveloping higher education, it's because 30 years ago, under the Manmohan Singh government, the government of India decided that it would stop being the primary funder of higher education. Right? The government stopped aid to private institutions. It stopped the public-private partnership system, right? And restricted itself to only funding government institutions. Right? So the thing that the development that the NEP calls the commercialization of higher education springs essentially from the government's withdrawal. Right? How will you stop the commercialization of higher education unless the government becomes a major player, unless the government steps in to, in some sense, rationalize the business of the financing of higher education? Right? That question is a question that goes hanging. An interesting thing they say is that state institutions offering law education must consider offering bilingual education for future lawyers and judges. It's a very important thing. It's happening in several places in Karnataka and Tamil Nadu and so on, right? But one thing it does not address is you have an elite cadre of law schools, the National Law School of India, the NLU, the NUJS, right? All these cream institutions are essentially English medium institutions, right? The recommendation should reach as far as to transform those institutions also, right? If NLSIU is in Bangalore, it should offer courses in law in English, in Kannada, because Kannada is the home language, right? National Law School serves all of South India in some sense, right? So possibly courses in Telugu, courses in Tamil, courses in Malayalam, right, should also become the norm, right? And I think this recommendation should actually extend as far as professional education in other fields also, right? It shouldn't stop only at law. The other point, two or three other points that I'll quickly refer to, which I find interesting in the policy. One is the idea of adult education and lifelong learning. Right? Earlier, we only had the idea of adult education, which was focused on adult literacy. Right? The new element that has come in is the idea of lifelong learning. Right? So for affiliated colleges, this is an interesting proposition. It means that you're able to look at offering your students not just the degree that they will get now, right, but equipping them through that degree to transfer their skills they have learned to other disciplines, to other processes, right, as the situation may demand in the future, right? Or the possibility of them coming back to retrain at various points when it becomes necessary, right? It will take a lot of thinking and planning, no doubt, but it's an interesting possibility. The other thing that they talk about is setting up a library network, right, across the country, right, that will provide reading material in not just English, but in all the regional languages. One other thing that the NEP does, remember that the NEP was completed just before the pandemic hit us and online learning became the norm, right? It says teachers require suitable training and development to be effective online educators. It identifies online education as a frontier, as a future engagement that will become valuable in terms of large-scale government policies such as the graduate enrollment ratio and so on, right? It's interesting to see that this moment of vision has occurred. We are going through that moment in an accelerated form because of the pandemic, right? For affiliated colleges, the learning that we get from this engagement with online education is valuable. Right now, it's a very painful engagement, right? Networks are bad, power situation is bad, browsers are unreliable, all that is true. But as we deal with it and learn to adapt to it and learn from the experience, right? The possibility of a kind of blended mode or of finding ways of making online education work become very real. Linus Torvalds, the software guy, once said, a problem is only as difficult as the number of eyeballs that are examining it, right? The moment online education becomes something that you and I are engaging with, it becomes possible for creative solutions to emerge. The last interesting aspect that I want to draw, and this is something that I want to quarrel with a little bit. The policy says it unequivocally endorses, basically it supports a substantial increase in public investment in education by both the central government and all state governments. The center and the states will work together to increase the public investment in education to reach 6% of the GDP at the earliest. So currently, apparently, the rate of investment is 4.4%, right? So in some senses, the government has been shortchanging itself, right? And so the NEP very correctly points out that shortfall and says that this 1.6% increase, which is a huge increase to 6%, must be done in a time-bound fashion, right? But the other possibility I would like to offer here is that if we are saying that our investment in education is an investment in transforming our society, then why do we have to be restricted by a magic number like 6? Right? If we want the potential of the unrealized potential of our young countrymen to be realized, right? We should be more ambitious than 6%, right? We should recast that number, right? And invest much more substantially now, right? Because that investment will pay its dividends very, very quickly and also in a sustainable long-term fashion. So these are the points of interest I have found in the national education policy. Usually when people talk about the policy, they're either all for it, right, or all entirely against it. My own experience has been a mixed one, right? There are contradictions in it, there are silences in it, there are things that I find problematic, and yet at the same time, I also find many encouraging things within it, right? Many correct identifications of problems and solutions, right, at the same time. Right? And this returns us to the idea of imagining and adapting from this policy. Right? So as teachers in affiliated colleges, there is one aspect that policies like these don't address because they're not interested in it and also because they don't know it. Right? And that is the actual on the ground experience. Right? Now, in terms of the courses that we run in an affiliated college, right? There is a university syllabus, there is a university examination, there are many ways in which your hands are tied. But if you think beyond this, right, you have great freedom, right? The way in which you shape the degree experience of your students is all yours, right? When in the 1980s in St. Joseph's College, we had a very far-sighted principal named Father Nelapathy, who called his colleagues together and said, in Tamil Nadu and Kerala, autonomy has begun to happen. So at some point, it will also start happening in Karnataka. We must prepare for that moment, right, by coming up with interesting experiments. Right? Let us not worry about when autonomy will come. Let us prepare for it through experiments with curriculum, experiments with courses, experiments with examinations, and so on. And this spirit went into many young people who had just joined the institution. Right? With the result that St. Joseph's was ready for autonomy, right? Even though autonomy finally came only in 2005. Right? This conversation happened sometime around the year 1981 or 1982, right? But the many years of experience in terms of building interesting certificate courses outside the curriculum, building student activities, building association activities, right? Building interesting concepts such as open book exams and various other innovative methods of teaching, learning, and assessment, right? All these became very useful because when autonomy came, the institution was prepared for it. So two things had happened, right? One, the college became associated with unique experiences, right? And this is something that a college like SFS or any affiliated college must always focus on, right? You may be an affiliated college, but the student who looks at your college must be able to look and say, what is happening here is unusual, is unique, is different, is valuable, right? This comes from a focus on what I call building experientiality, right? All of us have great freedom there. And that is the place from where imagining a policy also becomes easy, becomes possible, right? The second point I want to make is that of becoming autonomous before autonomy is formally granted to you, right? The room that is available for that experimentation, right? You must quickly seize on, right? Read the policy, look at some of the recommendations that it's making, look at what vibes with your experiences, right? And try and build autonomously, right? Whether it's courses, whether it's support mechanisms for students, whether it is interesting ways of accessing concepts, right? It can be from any direction, right? But the experience of thinking autonomously must become part of the institutional culture, right? Just to give you another example, right? Now, all colleges today have what is known as an IQAC, an internal quality assurance cell, right? But if you ask the question, is the IQAC's purpose about compliance with norms that come from NAC and the UGC, or is the IQAC's job conversation? That you'll immediately see what is beginning to happen in many institutions across the country, right? Compliance becomes more the norm, right? Because it's easy to do, because it means you get what you are supposed to get from the system, right? But its real possibility is conversation, is debate, right? Is the willingness to experiment. This is what I call thinking autonomously, right? And it is the challenge before every IQAC and every college to be able to balance the element of compliance. I'm not saying it's unnecessary, right? But it cannot be the be-all and the end-all. It cannot be the only purpose of the IQAC, right? The IQAC must be able to venture into conversation, into debate, into challenge, right? When that culture of conversation and thinking aloud enters the institution, right? Building experientiality becomes a reality, right? Preparing for autonomy, right, has begun to happen, right? The third takeaway that I would like to point out as something that every institution can usefully do is that of being invested in the local community, right? When we look at colleges in Bangalore, right, and look at the surrounding areas, the college always looks like a spaceship or a rocket, right? Every college is a spectacular building, right? More often than not, right? Now, this is not wrong, right? People need things to look up to aspire towards, to feel inspired by, right? But colleges must also engage substantially with local communities, right? They must be able to be higher education institutions while also exploring the community networking and community college aspects as much as possible, right? The NEP makes some moves in this direction, some recommendations in this direction, but the exact nature of this community connect, right, can only come from teachers and managements of specific colleges, right? Because you know the community and the world that you're dealing with, right? Let me try and give you a specific example of what I'm talking about, right? Some 5 years ago, there was a big sort of news flash in Bangalore, because in one of the suburbs of Bangalore, there was a sudden series of attacks on African students, right? The immediate provocation was a road accident. Some student from Tanzania was driving a car carelessly, and there was an accident and somebody died. And there was a kind of spontaneous sort of riot that broke out, right? And many innocent African students were beaten up and lots of things happened. And it caused a lot of soul searching in the city, right? Saying, has Bangalore changed? Has something gone wrong with us as a city, and so on, right? But if you think carefully about what happened, right, in some ways, those students were set up for this moment, because what happens typically is that the students come from a foreign country, they are given no orientation whatsoever to the place that they are coming to as students. They live in a kind of bubble. They have no encounter with the city and the local community, and this immediately begins to breed trouble, right? Now, when education is commercialized to a certain extent, everybody becomes a customer, and your interaction with them doesn't go beyond that. But it's possible for that to have been done in a more human way, in a more humane way, right? Those African students could have been equipped with a little introductory Kannada, right, to help them adjust to the neighborhood, to help them build bonds and connections in the neighborhood, right? When people speak your language, when people make an effort to speak your language, right? Very often connection immediately begins to happen, right? In a commercialized sort of space, these acts of imagination don't occur, right? But it's possible for community engagement to happen, for every college to be sensitive about the fact that it's bringing together people from different parts of the country, different parts of the world. They have to negotiate with the local community, right? If something is done to make that happen in a creative way, in a sensitive way, right? That part of the equation becomes easy. But moving beyond that, right? It's important for the expertise that every local institution has, right, to go out into the local community, right? Not just to students who can afford to pay for education, but also for those who don't have money, those who don't have means of access, right? What can be done for them, right? That question, I think, is an important question, right? So these three takeaways, right, are there in the NEP in some form, right? For affiliated colleges, right? It's important to work on these and come up with individual, customized ways of making these takeaways work. Right? I think that would be a very important move for higher education institutions right now. It's part of what I'm calling the act of imagining. Right. Those are some of the things I wanted to say to you. I'm sorry about this very disembodied conversation we are having. That's due to unpredictable technical problems, right? But thank you for your patient attention. If people have questions, I'll be very happy to listen to the questions. I don't know if I'll immediately have an answer, but it's always a great opportunity to think about questions that people raise. I think I saw one question in the chat. Let me just see if I can read it and respond to it. Okay, quite a few questions. All right. NEP states that the new regulatory system will foster this overall culture of empowerment and autonomy by gradually phasing out the system of affiliated colleges. My views on whether this is really feasible. Is it not a wiping away of the effort of many institutions which have built the Indian educational system and handing over to corporates? All right. The first question, is it really feasible? I don't think it can be done in a period of 15 years. They're being super optimistic when they say that, right? What they're calling an overall culture of empowerment and autonomy, right? It actually takes time, right? You have to energize an academic cadre. You have to give them freedom. You have to give them time to make mistakes, right? You have to support them through it, right? None of this is going to work. The big question that it doesn't fully answer is, where is the money going to come from, right? It's going to come only when you increase the allocation of the GDP, right? It has to fund, the government has to fund this process, right? Only then is it possible. So my answer to your first question, is this really feasible, is yes, if the government agrees to get back into funding. It must not only fund state-sponsored state institutions, it must also fund institutions like SFS. And it should be a funding that is minimum strings attached, right? It must build this public-private partnership element very, very sincerely. Only then are these things feasible, right? Otherwise, as you predict, right, what will happen is that you'll have a predator economy where the big fish is swallowing up the small fish, right? Some college that is doing good work but is unable to balance its books, right, will end up auctioning its benches and desks and its faculty to some bigger operator with deeper pockets, right? So these are some of the crucial and dangerous silences in the NEP, right? I wish they had stuck their necks out more and said, just fund higher education itself, just fund education without counting the pennies for the next 25 years. Right? That would have been a truly great and a truly visionary recommendation to have happened. Okay, how long will it take the NEP 2020 to adopt completely? Okay, here you must understand that education is something that is both a center and a state subject, right? Which means that the center and the states have to do conversation. When an NEP is floated, states can choose what they want to adapt or adopt, right? And what they don't want to engage with at all. Okay, so one thing that is definitely going to happen is that there will be definitely a non-uniform response to the NEP, right? A state like Kerala or a state like Tamil Nadu is going to make for various reasons, right? Some of them political, some of them social. They're going to make very different responses to the NEP, right? A state like Karnataka seems to have committed to taking on the NEP, but there has been a wave of reaction, right? And so that has caused the powers that be, the vice chancellors and the minister of education, the government, the bureaucracy, to shift stance a little bit and to look at negotiating. The original plan was that the new curriculum would come into force immediately in 2021 itself, right? But now that looks like it might get pushed a little bit because conversations are going back and forth, right? So it'll be interesting to watch what happens in Karnataka. In a very diversified Indian ethos, this is Madhu's question, how much good will it serve to have one nation attitude in research? Will it not hinder the very spirit of research? I don't want to comment on the one nation aspect. I would just like to point out to the fact that research is itself divergent and heterogeneous, right? One of the things that the administrations have been pushing on us is application-oriented research and results-oriented research. But very often research is not like that, right? It's truly experimental research sometimes fails, sometimes takes a long time. It cannot be slotted into a 1-year plan or a 2-year plan, right? And there are many such diversities, right? So this is unfortunately one of the problems with educational policy in India. When we take a buzzword like research, right? What we're essentially importing the way it is discussed in some other country, right? We are not looking at local realities, right? So this is what I like to call the looking London, talking Tokyo problem, right? We need to look at what research is possible, right? And what research is necessary and what diversities we have to encourage all at the same time. Right? And in that sense, yes, right, setting up a central national research foundation, right, is actually going to, at the very least, it's not going to change anything, right? At the most dangerous extent, it could actually end up circumscribing research altogether and practically outlawing certain kinds of research. Okay, question from Jacinta Matthew. Can you please elaborate on community colleges? Okay, community colleges are a specific structure, right? Now, the NEP seems to offer things interesting. There's a one-line statement where it says, after 4 p.m., the institution should still be open for learning experiences that other people who are not students can come and partake of, right? So essentially what they're offering is a vision of the institutions continuing to serve in whatever way possible the local community. Right? Now, how do you zero in on something like this? Right? Now, look at your immediate neighborhood. Right? What are the educational needs there that adults might have? People who are working. Right? Are there working women who could benefit from a do-it-yourself kind of course in microfinance, right? Or in legal rights, or in learning how to interpret contracts that they don't understand, right? These are some of the ways in which the expertise that is there in colleges can go into the community. Now, these don't have to be things that are paid for, right? They can be done as informal education enterprises, right, by people who are able to see value in this kind of service-minded enterprise initiative, right? It's important for us to be thinking of things like that. Unfortunately, very often in teaching, our jobs tend to get sort of set around the immediate details, our timetables, our papers, our assignments, right, our reports, our form filling, and all of that, right? It's good for colleges to be able to think of this sort of initiative, right? How can our institution meet a real social need? It won't happen till we enter conversation, right, with the immediate neighborhood, with the immediate community that the college is engaging with, right? Will providing autonomy to all the institutions affect the quality of education? I'm willing to go with this cautiously, like I did in response to the earlier question, right? If the institution has the drive, right, to do interesting work, right, then a kind of graded autonomy process is good for them, right, and good for everybody else also. Right? I don't think trusting autonomy on everybody is going to have any benefits, right? And when I say autonomy, I'm talking only about academic autonomy, right? The freedom to design your curriculum, the freedom to run your exams, right? I'm not talking about financial autonomy in terms of sink or swim, right? There, the guarantee is that most institutions will simply sink. It's not possible to stay afloat in a market economy situation unless you change your entire style of functioning and become corporate, right? In which case, the first question you will ask is, which course is making money? Let us focus on that, right? So that kind of autonomy giving, which the governments definitely want to do, right, is dangerous for higher education because it will limit choices available to students. It will have all kinds of deleterious consequences, right? But graded academic autonomy, right, is a useful experiment. That is, from my experiences, I found it useful. Okay, community colleges is not a specific reference, but engagement with community is what I'm talking about. I think I've made that point clear. The NEP says it in one sentence, right? I can find the exact sentence if you want me to. The second question is how to overcome the commercialization of higher education. You can't really overcome it unless there are serious policy shifts, right? And the most important policy shift is a return to government funding, right? If we say we are sitting on a population dividend, right, it means that we are looking at a vast number of young people who need to get better access to education, right? The old logic, the logic we've been hearing for 30 years that the market will somehow miraculously do it, has been proved wrong again and again, right? The lesson that we are learning is that when you say let the market take care of things, what happens is that the student who comes in to take education may not be the student who needs it. The person who can pay is not necessarily the best recipient or the most worthy recipient or the person who needs the education the most, right? So that problem, the market has no answer to. It can only come through a process of gritting our teeth and saying that this is an important investment in our future, right? Now, if you look at Bernie Sanders, the Democratic senator who nearly got the nomination for president, right? Or Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour politician, now no longer active, both of them got a lot of popular support, right? Because they spoke of making university education free, right? And for rich countries like theirs, it's very eminently possible, right? We are not even saying make it free. We are just saying make it cheap, right? So I suppose the really courageous thing to do would be to stop saying make it cheap and say make it free, right? Nothing terrible will happen to India if we make higher education free, right? If we make it accessible to everybody who desires it, right? The government of India can afford to underwrite that process. It is not going to become bankrupt out of doing it, right? That risk, I think it's time for governments in India to start thinking of seriously. So that's my answer to your question on commercialization of higher education.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Will there be some authority at the state level to monitor the working? So what they're proposing is something called the light but tight regulation, right? So instead of UGC, what they want is another body that will sort of oversee all the different kinds of education, right? Well, they want statutory bodies like NAC and other things to continue, right? So that's the, so what is the solution they're offering? Is it a new radical thing? I don't think so. That part of their thinking is just, old wine in new bottles. Okay, there's a question from Professor Archana. As a professor having taught and affiliated in autonomous colleges, what are the challenges you have faced under autonomy? Does NEP pose further challenges for autonomous colleges? Okay, let me respond to that. See, one of the things in autonomy, one of the great exhilarating things about autonomy is the fact that you can design your own syllabus, right? Now, what does that mean depends upon your college's relationship with the university, specifically the university department, right? Because some university departments tend to be very liberal. I'm not going to name anybody here, right? But some university departments are liberal and open-minded, right? And so that conversation can be very useful and beautiful and fulfilling, right? But I've also heard that there are university departments which tell autonomous colleges or departments in autonomous colleges, right? The mother department tells the autonomous college department, you cannot depart from the university syllabus more than 20%, right? It sounds very reasonable, but it's simply the most idiotic formulation you can think of. Because how are you going to quantify that 20%? Right? And so very often this becomes a talking point, right? And people give up after a point and just continue with some small revisions. You move one part of the syllabus to second year, you move something to the first year. So this is one real challenge in autonomy. People sort of lose the appetite for fight, lose the appetite for innovation because there can be this kind of pushback from the university. But the university is not a monolithic institution. It's many departments talking to many departments in autonomous colleges, right? So in that relationship, there are variations. When it's good, it's very positive. When it's not, when the university department tends to be conservative, then the space immediately gets reduced significantly, right? This is one of the challenges. The other challenge is time, right? Because when you're autonomous, you're self-regulating, which means a lot of the documentation and a lot of the rules writing and a lot of the procedure framing, all this becomes part of your work, right? So you end up sitting in meetings and long meetings and in doing lots of documentation work. So we are definitely doing a lot more of that than we did under the affiliated system, right? And so time starts disappearing in autonomy, right? If you're not careful. There too, I would like to point out that there is scope for innovation and creativity, right? So you have to be very careful about what you want to change or make a game plan in terms of, I will change this first and then I will change this and I will do it slowly, right? That's one way of sort of making sure that time is available to individual teachers, to people in departments. Another way of doing it is to say we'll make as radical a break as possible at the word go, right? Because once you've done that break and you just have to wait for the dust to settle and then you can sort of set some things in place, right? I personally favor the radical departure, right? You might as well just make the switch and then deal with the consequences one by one. So these are some of the challenges, right? One debate that never gets settled in autonomous colleges is how do you do testing, right? Is it to be memory recall, or do you, now that we have the freedom, should you experiment, right? So there too, you won't get one answer from any autonomous college, right? Some departments will have successfully innovated and come up with interesting things. Some will be forced into caution because, you know, there are other constraints operating upon them. Some may just not want to take risks. So that variation is there, right? And yeah, so dealing with some of these things is a definite challenge. Does NEP pose further challenges for autonomous colleges? Yes and no, right? In the sense that what the NEP is proposing in terms of these shifts in course structure, right? That can be very disruptive for autonomous colleges, right? Which is why they're all asking for time to study the recommendations and then make their own counter proposals, right? They're not very sure about whether some of these ideas will work, right? That is one part of the response, definitely, right? But many of these things, see, the thing is, it depends. Right now, what the government of Karnataka has taken from the NEP is this 4-year course idea, right? And they've made a certain curriculum for that 4-year course. Many of the other things they've not yet responded to, right? So that is still to come. So we don't know. The policy becomes real only when the state government decides on what it chooses to accept and what it chooses to not implement, right? So only after knowing that fully, right? We don't know it entirely yet. We've seen essentially the tip of the iceberg, that's all, right? Over the next 1.5 to 2 years, I think we will understand it better. I hope that answers your question. As an English professor, the language implementations of the NEP are a rather zone where these contradictions I'm talking about become visible. On the one hand, they say we value language, we want people to be well-rounded and all of that. On the other hand, they're cruelly, snapping away at languages and reducing their importance in the system, right? My view is that in every discipline, the languages have an important counterweight factor to offer. They offer you another way of looking at things, another way of thinking, and it's a very important part of university education, right? The reason it was put there as a 2-year course or a 4-semester course, right, was because the people who originally thought up our education system understood our social realities, right? As one where English will be important because it's a kind of international language, but the equally important task is that of expertise transfer, right? Science has to become Indian. Social science has to become Indian. It has to enter local conversations and be evaluated by local imaginations, right? That's only going to happen if you have people who are able to switch between English and mother tongue, between English and local language, right? When reducing it, they're contradicting themselves. On the one hand, they say languages are threatened, we want to protect them. They themselves are doing the greatest damage in their recommendations. NEP and job requirements. So the NEP doesn't actually sort of make specific norms visible in terms of everyone must have PhDs and things like that. But what it proposes, right, is a research orientation for the teacher. So implicitly what it's saying is it's best if professors have PhDs, right? But at the level of undergraduate education, is it necessary for everybody to have a PhD? That's a moot point, right? Sometimes it's useful, sometimes there's really no need for it as well, right? So that's one of the responses I have to make to the implications of what the NEP is talking about. I think the best way for people to do a PhD is in service, right? It keeps you grounded. You have reality to be in contact with because of your job, and you have to find the discipline and the time to do your research at the same time, right? Doing away with that model of research is actually going to be counterproductive for undergraduate education, definitely, right? I don't know about higher education, but definitely for undergraduate education, right? Specialized skills and expertise. One of the things that the NEP refers to many times, right, when they talk about teachers and teaching and all of that, right? I'll give you the exact quotation. Let me just. The quote. Yeah, this is what they say. They say, reaffirming the integrity of faculty and institutional leadership positions through merit appointments and career progression based on teaching, research, and service. So they are effectively putting their weight behind the formats like the API, the Accumulating Points Index, right? They're talking about, promotions and things like that not happening automatically or in response to certain norms, but out of a kind of performance analysis, right? Those are some of the things that the NEP seems to offer. Okay, there's a good question from Dr. Nebula. She says, NEP considers teachers and faculty as the heart of the learning process. How their recruitment, working environment, and service conditions will be monitored, right? It makes some noises about security, about job security and so on, right? But beyond that, it doesn't commit to anything, right? So that's a zone where, since the NEP doesn't make any pronouncements, it will mean that state governments will call the shots there and make their own sense of the NEP's recommendations, right? That's in some ways a good thing, in some ways not such a good thing, right? Okay, education has become commercial. How to expect service and the holistic in education? You can't in a commercializing system when everything is in terms of value for money, when it's considered in terms of what money it brings in, right? You're immediately turning education into a trade rather than into an act of service, right? Now, I'm not one of those romantics who believe that right, it has to be entirely service oriented, right? Some level of entrepreneurship, some level of that kind of, some freedom for that kind of thing is definitely necessary, right? But as I was saying earlier, right, you want to curb commercialization, you have to look at government funding. There is simply no other way of doing it. Now, the NEP talks about, raising funds through philanthropy, through volunteerism, through alumni funding and all of that. At that point, I don't know in which country they are, right? It has worked in a certain sense in a prosperous economy like the United States, right? I don't know if that is going to work, right, in a country like India, right? So my response to the commercialization problem is, let us find new ways of making government funding work. What opportunities or restrictions does the NEP provide for foreign universities to impart quality education in India? The NEP doesn't really address the question, right? It doesn't, the only thing it does is talk about broad basing access, and it produces this new category called SEDG, socially and economically disadvantaged groups, into which it disappears everybody, right, without looking at the fact that specific groups have specific problems with access, right? Dalits have one kind of problem. The communities described as scheduled tribes have a different kind of set of problems with access, right? So it does things like that, right? It leaves the door open, right? It does not explicitly bar these things. It does not commit to anything there, right? But I think that question has also been answered in some broad sense because 10, 15 years ago, this was a big debate issue, right? Allowing foreign investment in education, etc., right? It has become very clear that it would be very difficult for those operators to flourish in India, right? The efforts of doing a nut and bolts relocation or a nut and bolt setup in India, right, is prohibitively expensive for them, right? So what they will look at are other ways of entering the market, right? It's one other thing that has changed with the urban middle class is that they are more willing to spend money. It's easier to draw them abroad, right? And that's the easier market to cater to, right? But the one thing that the NEP is definitely doing in pushing this 4-year thing, right, is making it easier for the urban middle class to seek education abroad, right? It's a step that is not very necessary because across the world, universities have decided to make their peace with the Indian system, right? And to find ways of accommodating students from India, right? Okay. There's a question Our government is imitating USA, England. Yeah, definitely, right? There are several ways in which we are stupidly focused on Western systems, right? Now, these guys who say Nalanda, Takshashila and all should look at the more valuable thing in Indian education, that it's based on a principle of justice, right? So instead of worrying about things like how many Indian universities figure in the top 100 of some Western, some US or UK list of rankings, right? We should have the courage to produce a social justice ranking, right? And say how do universities of the world perform when it comes to achieving social justice in access? My feeling is that your Oxford and Harvard and Cambridge and all will come at the bottom of that list, right? Small, insignificant Indian universities will have a better track record in terms of receptivity, in terms of not doing unnecessary gatekeeping, in terms of opening access out to underprivileged and disadvantaged communities, right? The primary purpose of education in India is that justice, right? We have to own it and be proud of it and try to make it better, right? Instead of imitating models from other parts of the world. I hope that answers your question, Professor Karibasavan Gowda. Balachandra Kamath wants to know how to get in touch with me. I'll leave my email ID here in the chat. If you want to have a further conversation, you can get in touch. All right, some alumni here as well. Nice to have met you. Okay, I think I was very apprehensive about whether the session would last its proposed length, 2 to 4. And after the technical problems began, I was even more apprehensive. But thank you for the many questions, right? I've not been able to answer all of them fully or well, but thank you for the questions. It makes me think, and that's an opportunity that I welcome, right? Please do have conversations in your colleges, in your universities, in your institutions about the NEP. Read it carefully, right? Look at its opportunities and look at its problems, right? And also debate it in terms of the different faculties that you have. Science, commerce, arts, languages, all of you need to talk about it, right? And you need to also be heard, right? Please speak to your college managements, ask them to make representations, ask them to represent specific parts of your problems and anxieties and all of that, right? Our governments are too used to people not holding them responsible, right? So they need to relearn that lesson, that people will raise their voice, people will raise concerns, we have to respond, right? Right. Thank you. I think there are no more questions. All the people who have said kind things in the chats, thank you very much. Sorry once again about the disembodied presentation. Thank you for listening in spite of the fact that it's harder to listen to just a voice rather than to a video. Thank you very much. Back to the organizers.
Yes, sir. So thank you, sir, for that very, very informative and absorbing session on imagining on educational policy for affiliated college. We do understand from the comments posted on the chat box, we understand that it was quite a very inspirational and very, very informative session. And we do appreciate you for taking the time to respond to all the questions that were raised as well. We are indeed very grateful to you for having imparted so much of knowledge and information on the different aspects of today's topic. We do appreciate you, sir. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much. The pleasure is all mine. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you. So So as we've come to the end of our FTP, day 5, I now request Professor Ramandeep to propose the vote of thanks.
Good evening, one and all present here. On this wonderful evening, I would like to present the vote of thanks. Today's session was very informative and knowledgeable. Sir has thrown light on various aspects of NEP. Thank you, sir. I thank all the participants from across India for making this day a grand success. Once again, I thank you all for your sincere attention and participation. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
Over to you, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. The feedback link, dear participants, is posted in the chat box, and the same will also be shared in the WhatsApp groups. Kindly do fill it. Also, please note, we would be getting into day 6 of our FTP tomorrow, and we will have a discussion on the topic unboxing outcome-based education. So we hope to see you tomorrow, and we believe that the FTP sessions were quite informative and useful to you. Once again, thank you one and all, and have a great evening ahead. Thank you again.